So today is my pleasure to welcome again Yoshua Bengio, a friend and also a recognized leader in the world of AI and pioneer in deep learning. Joshua is joined with Gabriel Kotsis, who is the president of ACM, the Association of Computer Machinery, and she's also a full professor of computer science at Johannes Kepler University in Linz, Austria, leading the Department of Telecommunication and Division of Corporate Information System. She has had scientific contribution, including similar work in the field of workload characterization for parallel and distributed systems and performance management of computer systems. She has organized ACM conferences and workshops, and in 2016 received an award for her accomplishment with the ACM Women in Courage conference series. She is a founding member of ACM Europe Council, and she became in 2014 an ACM distinguished member. And again, she is now currently the president of ACM. So Gabriel is joining us to have a conversation and dialogue with Yoshua Bengio. And Yoshua, we had the pleasure to have you before last week and talking about the opportunities of collaboration in using AI and machine learning to combat COVID and global pandemics and to use AI for the benefit of society. Today, we'd like to invite you again to join us to talk about the opportunity of AI for the common good and how can we chart a future and roadmap in using AI for social good. So with great pleasure, I invite you, Joshua, to start with a short keynote, and then we'll invite, and by the way, Gabriel, you're invited to join us as well to have a conversation, dialogue, and some questions to Yoshua about the same topic, and probably we'll close with some Q&A from the audience. Without further ado, Yoshua, welcome.
Hi. Thank you, Amir. Let me share my screen. So I will try to brainstorm with you about where, directions for the future of AI for social good, and what are some of the challenges that I see for really bringing AI to the benefit of everyone. So AI is a powerful tool. We are very far from human level AI, but still AI can be extremely useful. We have to not forget that it's a tool, and tools can be used positively, bring social value, or they could be used by a few to increase their wealth or their power. And so one of the important questions we need to ask is, how do we set up the incentives for AI to move us in a better direction for society? And where do the current incentive systems lead us? Because I think there may be some concerns that are growing as AI is becoming more and more powerful. In particular, it can be used by those already empowered to concentrate even more power, which is essentially going against our ideals of democracy. Which means somehow we need to find ways that those tools can be governed by our collective needs, whether it's within each country or internationally. So I don't need for this audience to tell you about all the positive potential of AI, whether it's in medicine, environment, education, justice, humanitarian applications. What I want to focus on today are some of the things we could maybe think about together to maybe steer a little bit the incentive system for our planet to make AI used for the better good of humanity. And I'm going to talk about mostly three topics briefly during this keynote. One is very close to Amir's heart and has to do with how we can do a better job internationally to coordinate AI for social good projects. So because of this venue, this conference is really about the international community and what we can do. I think it's good to ask how we can do a better job at bringing the expertise from many different parts in the world, the domain expertise and funding and so on. Then I'm going to consider a particular area of application of AI, which is drug discovery, something which is currently done mostly in large pharmaceutical companies, but researchers in academia have been contributing a lot of ideas. And I'm going to ask questions about how AI and computers in general might change the way that we could do drug discovery in the future, but that maybe there are obstacles to doing this optimally because of the incentives, current incentive systems, which favor secrecy instead of sharing data and knowledge, which if we did could reduce the cost of medical innovation. So I'm going to speak towards a proposal, or at least thinking about a proposal that could enable countries which want to work together on this to share the cost of public domain drug discovery. And I'll say a few words as well about something that's more on the normative side, right? The first two topics are really about what we can actually do that's concrete to bring good with AI. And then the third item I want to talk about is how do we change our rules of the game? How do we change our laws? How do we change our international norms to minimize the negatives that may come from advertising paid for manipulation, maybe in social media, things like killer robots, discrimination, and so on, which we know there's a lot of discussion around regarding the applications of AI. Okay, so let's go into the first topic. Amir and others have set up this organization, and there are other groups around the world that are pushing in the same direction, where I think really it would help if a number of nations got together to coordinate these efforts for AI for social good projects. And the reason for this is you have people with different pieces of the puzzle sitting in different places in the world. And somehow we need to find the good ways of bringing them together. The people in NGOs or governments in developing countries that know about problems, they know what matters, but they may not have the expertise, or they may not have the funding. And then, there are, I know grad students in universities want to help, but they know nothing about these problems. They might work on something thinking it could be useful, but if it's not connected to the problem owners, it's probably going to be a waste of time, and it might be a paper, but it's not going to really help people. And so it's really important that we work harder, and this whole conference, I think, is aiming at that, at making sure that the R&D development efforts of AI are better connected with the needs. And of course, we can also help making sure that what is done is going to be deployed in a way that works. So there is the funding aspect, but also you want to make sure that it's going to be deployed in a way that's going to help the actual people who need that help. And so the idea of AI Commons is to construct a sort of clearinghouse to help people figure out with their expertise, where can I contribute, and to help them prioritize where, projects and, that need, where their expertise, what they can bring is going to be most valuable. Let me move on to my second topic. So this one is a bit more complicated. And in a way, you can think of it as trying to consider a special area of the application of AI, which I got involved in, as I discussed in my last presentation on the 24th, because of COVID. And it made me realize that maybe we have an alignment problem. And I'm sure this is not a new thing. People have been discussing this in books like Big Pharma, Bad Pharma, and so on. The alignment problem between the public good, saving as many lives as possible, and the current incentive system in the pharmaceutical industry. And what's making this maybe a bigger issue today is we are at a transition phase from a technological point of view, whereas drug development and discovery was mostly done in the heads of chemists and biologists and so on, to a mode which is going to be more and more driven by data, right? And AI and physics simulators, so software essentially. So this is really different in fundamental ways. And in particular, you know that for AI systems to be successful, they need a lot of data, you know. So right now there's about 10 large pharmaceutical companies. So if each of them were contributing some amount of data to solving particular problems, and they do it right now secretly, we might have a lot of redundancy and lost opportunity for bringing all of those pieces of information together in machine learning methods to really speed up and reduce the cost of drug development. Unfortunately, the current incentive system goes completely against that, right? If you're working in one of those companies, if you're one of the executives of one of those companies, it's clear that you want to keep your information secret, because otherwise your really large capital investment is going to potentially be wasted, as other companies might take your information and make money with it and bypass your sources of revenue that should be compensating for the investment you made in research. So in that, I mean, pharma companies are sharing some data, but they usually don't share the most important data exactly for those reasons. And in that secrecy environment is even invading the academic research world, because if you're a PhD student and you find something interesting in your research that could lead to a drug in the future, you might not want to share that information as you would normally as an academic, because you would think, oh, I could maybe start a company to commercialize this thing, or I could sell it to a company that would do it. Either way, the current incentive system is really slowing down the rate of progress. And because we're talking about drugs that can save lives, it also means people are going to be dying where, under a different incentive system, they could be alive. So what could we do? I mean, one option is to just throw your hands up and say, well, that's life. That's how we are organized in our society, and what can we do? But I think it's worth thinking about options, and I think we have some models that we could potentially expand on in order to explore potentially better social organization for drug development. And the inspiration and model that I'm suggesting we look at is how academic research is being funded and incentivized. So in general, academics will be rewarded not by some profits made by their work, but by getting recognition for their work. And that recognition comes from what? From sharing the knowledge they are acquiring. So another interesting aspect of academic labs is they're at the same time competing with each other for funding and collaborating, because of course the knowledge they're building up is found by incrementally on top of the knowledge that has already been shared by others. So that's an interesting model, but how could we turn something like this into a pipeline that can do much more applied stuff, which is to discover new drugs? So what I'm suggesting is to create gradually a funding model for R&D in drug discovery, which would share a lot of the attributes of academic research funding, but with strong constraints on sharing, of course, even stronger than currently is in academia. The making sure that the resulting drugs are going to be free for poor countries, for example, and cheap for participating countries to create an incentive for countries to join in the cost of these developments. And as a first step, I think what we could do is fund an international effort, data collection, which is the blood for AI here, a data collection pipeline for chemical and biological assays to provide a benchmark for machine learning researchers who want to join the drug discovery R&D effort. And so this is motivated by the idea that the cost of acquiring that knowledge is fixed. But once we have that knowledge, like 99% of the cost of drugs is really finding those drugs. Once you have the chemical formula, actually building those, fabricating those drugs is almost free in comparison. So the usual market incentives may not be appropriate here, in addition to the fact that people are willing to pay almost any price if it's going to save their life, which again distorts the market system. So we need to think of a way that it will be profitable for countries to join a club like this, simply because the cost of the R&D is like a constant, but the benefits of joining, which is having those drugs for very cheap, could be shared easily. So that's my second bullet. Now let me go quickly on the third item regarding advertising and psychological manipulation. If you haven't seen the movie The Social Dilemma, I encourage you to see it. It's a bit of a dramatization of reality. I mean, AI is not like what they show, but I think it raises really important questions about not just the moral issue of psychological manipulation for someone else's benefit, but also how it may hurt our societies, especially democracy and individuals who become addicted to their phones. I think one thing that nobody talks about, and I'd like to raise here, is that it's not even clear that the advertising-funded system is good for capitalism. And the reason is that it favors large incumbents rather than the small companies and startups which want to pierce in a particular area, and thus actually slows innovation rather than accelerating it. Now, from a game theory point of view, the problem is if for any of the actors in the current system, like if you're a company, you have to put aside a part of your budget for advertising. Otherwise, you're going to be a loser compared to the ones which do, because advertising works. It does make people, act differently. But it's just because we haven't set the rules of the game, again, the incentive system, in a way that favors society. And so I think we have to rethink, maybe, for example, by thinking of social networks and search engines potentially as public services, or potentially other models where we regulate sufficiently those companies so that we avoid the kind of paid-for influence which can hurt either individual users or society. So I'm asking those questions. I don't have the answers, but I really think that we ought to think about those questions, but also think out of the box. Think that, okay, the world isn't frozen in the way that it currently is, that we might think of a different social and economic organization, at least in these areas that I've talked about, which would benefit more the public. And if we don't do that, I think as AI becomes more powerful, we really run into dangers that are going to grow. One way to think about it is we're building very powerful technology. And eventually anybody can grab that technology and use it in a way that could be dangerous for a lot of other people. It's like if everyone could just throw off a major nuclear weapon. That wouldn't be good, right? So as software becomes, easier to use and more powerful, I think we need to rethink the way that our societies are organized to avoid longer term catastrophes. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I would like to invite Gabriel Kotsis, President of ACM, to join us now to have a dialogue with Joshua. Gabriel, welcome.
Yes, thank you very much, Amir, and thank you, Joshua, for your very inspiring talk. I would like to start asking you, you said that artificial intelligence has to be seen as a tool, and that this tool should be used for the collective needs and for the collective benefits. To what extent would you think that the people, the normal people, so to say, also understand those kind of tools? How much knowledge would they need?
Well, clearly, currently, most citizens don't understand enough those tools in order to be good citizens, which means participate in democracy and collective decision-making in a direction that's, the best one for their society. And so we have a big job to do in terms of education. Mm-hmm. Now, it doesn't mean that ordinary citizens need to understand the math behind or be able to program these things themselves. But although it would be a good thing, I think what is more important is that they understand the social consequences, and that they understand that it's not magic, that they understand what are the limitations. For example, in this talk, I didn't talk about killer robots, but it's something I talk about a lot. And one thing that people need to understand is that current AI and for foreseeable future, it is not going to understand social concerns, moral values, whereas a human being could. And so, if you're pressing the trigger of the gun, even if you receive an order to kill, you might decide not to do it. But a machine will just happily do it. Well, happily is not the right word here. We'll just do it, period, without having any understanding of the consequences. So that education, I think you're right, is something that we need to do better. And hopefully the conferences like the one we are in today are also going to help. But I also think that even the experts don't have the right education. So if you're a computer scientist, you learn a lot about programming and math and so on, but you don't learn that much about society, about social impact, about ethics. And this is dearly lacking in our education in this field.
Mm-hmm. So this also calls for more collaboration across the various disciplines, I would assume.
Yeah, actually, that was the theme of the conference I gave a few days ago here. As soon as you try to apply AI, and of course, AI for social good is mostly an application of AI. If you want to do it right, you have to be in a mode of collaboration. You have to be in a mode of humility where you realize you only know a little part of the puzzle, and there are these other people who know much more than you do. And so you really have to listen to them. You have to also be pedagogical to explain your stuff and find the right way of combining your strengths.
Mm-hmm. At that point, I would like to bring in one of the questions that seems appropriate now that appeared in the question and answer section, namely, there is a quote that we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. What do you think in the context of AI? To what extent would also AI influence us as a tool?
Yeah, I mean, this is the theme of the Social Dilemma movie. But I think we have to be careful here not to fall into the idea that like the programmers, the engineers, or the scientists who build those things, they're not responsible because, oh, it's the AI that did it. No, those systems are tools. They've been designed and built by humans. Now, it may be that those humans didn't foresee the consequences of the use of those tools. But they're still responsible to do their best to take that into consideration. So there's a notion of responsibility here, which we need to pay attention to. And so it's the way that we design those systems, the way that we deploy them, where, and then for what purpose, and who's going to benefit or who's going to be hurt, that we need to pay a lot more attention to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, talking about responsibility, as you mentioned, all AI methods rely on data.
Yeah.
So we also have a big responsibility with respect to data. And we also, I think, have to really create awareness among the people again about what kind of data they provide, they should provide, they could provide. And also the question you mentioned, the democratic principle on who owns the data. Do you have any vision on how we should proceed in that direction?
I certainly have some thoughts about it. So yeah, people need to understand that data is valuable because it can be used by AI. Now, it could be used against them, and that's something, you know, citizens and users of these products need to understand. It can also be used in their favor. So last week, I talked about the use of data for building epidemiological models of COVID-19. So in medical data in general, the data could be used in both directions. It could be used to help design better treatments. It could also potentially be used against yourself. Like maybe insurance companies might want to use that information to charge you more or something like this because you're at higher risk. So we need to have better, again, socioeconomic tools to manage the potential benefit and the potential harms of sharing data. And one direction that I'm really fond of is the idea of a data trust. So you see right now, when you share your data with a software company or a social network or a search engine or whatever, recommendation system, you have essentially, if you want to use those services and be part of society, you have to agree that they do what they want to do with the data. And you don't have negotiating power as a one person out of billions to dictate the terms of how the data could be used, should be used. But the idea of data trust is to create a third party that's going to be powerful enough, because it represents millions of people, to negotiate with those companies the terms by which the data should be used and not used. So think of it like financial trust create a separation between the people who put in money and the way that the money is invested. So here, as a user, I may choose a data trust whose goals are aligned with mine. I want to make sure that this data is used for the well-being of humanity and not used against me, for example. But I need to be represented by these organizations to deal on behalf of all the people who are sharing their data. But it's not going to happen by itself, right? It's going to require, again, governments to mandate these, essentially force the organizations that you take your data to go through those third parties. You could have a market for data trust, but you need government regulation to make sure that there is this separation between the people who provide the data and those who can take advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, trust, of course, is one dimension and one element where we would need governmental regulation. The other aspect is, as you said, data are valuable. So it's really a good, and is it something that can be sold? You gave your example of the new economy for the drug market, where the institutions would have a different incentive in sharing their data, but it could also be the case that the incentive is very straightforward, just making quick money. This holds for organizations, this could also hold for individuals. Individuals might want to sell their data because they need money urgently, like they're selling other items that they currently possess or have. And this could be also very risky. Do you think that also governmental regulations should somehow shape this data market from an economic perspective, from an
yeah, absolutely. I think data trust could help with that in part. People have to understand that data is not like ordinary goods. For the same reason I was talking about in my presentation, that once you have data in your hand, you can share it. I mean, you can sell it 1,000 times for essentially free. And so what happens is that companies will be incentivized to keep that data behind closed walls, or find mechanisms to prevent people from stealing that data, but it's very difficult. So I think our economic system right now isn't well structured for managing the value of data and making sure that we get the positive value out of it that we could.
Coming back to your vision, I would like to say, of your new economic model, not only for drug discovery, but maybe also for other kinds of things. How realistic is it, given the diverse interest actually of the many different players? There was, for example, one question about what kind of role could an individual PhD student play in this consortium, which is of course very different than the role of a big pharma industry.
Right.
And especially the pharma industry seems to have a tendency of rather closing their knowledge and not really willing to share. I'm not sure if this academically driven incentive model of sharing and benefiting would truly be successful. How can we promote this? How can we support this better?
Well, so first of all, we have to show that it works. And it's probably not going to be promoted by pharma, although they could benefit from it to some extent. You know, the pharmaceutical companies are already subcontracting a lot of the research. And so in a way, what I'm saying is, let's make sure that that research part is done in a data and knowledge efficient way, by making sure that the information is shared across the actors, and making sure that even a small player like a PhD student somewhere in a lab can contribute to that. And I think it's feasible with the right incentive systems. And these incentives could be created fairly easily if you know, a few countries would put the capital necessary to generate that initial, you know, data pipeline. So I think it's quite feasible. I think that the obstacles are more political. I can imagine some companies wanting to fight things like this, or I can imagine countries which have large pharma to be concerned about their industry. But really what I'm proposing is something that's, for starters, is really just about helping academia do a better job of contributing to drug development. Right now, academics can't do much because they're isolated in each of their labs. There's no global coordination, and they don't have the capital for generating the kind of data that would be needed for their work to become really effective. But you know, if we can make that drug discovery part more efficient, pharmaceutical companies will be happy to commercialize you know, the results of that research.
One other issue that has been brought up also in the question and answer section that also I wanted to ask you is, we have been talking before about the importance of collaboration across various disciplines, across various domains, but it is of course challenging. We don't speak the same language. Is there any specific advice that you could give on how this could be achieved successfully? Would the common goal be sufficient, or what would be major incentives or actual approaches that could work based on your experience?
Well, so there are many places where we could act to make this better. So one is in education and university education. Right now, there's a focus on training people to become experts at one thing. That's what a PhD is about. But even undergrad studies tend to be converging in some very pointy direction. So that is good. That's how, you know, science advances, you become an expert at something. But for your work to become useful in the world, often you need to learn how to collaborate with others, and you need that general knowledge of many areas of society and science in order to do that productively. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I believe as soon as you work on more applied projects, meaning that it's going to be deployed for real in the world, whether you're in a company or in academia, you're facing the issue of collaboration and working with other experts. So it's going to come anyways, but I think if we can just tune a little bit the culture so that people see the positive value of this, be prepared for it, that kind of collaboration is going to work better. And also, as I mentioned in my first point, if we create the communication tools, the collaboration tools, the platforms for collaboration that's going to facilitate that. We already have a lot of tools for these kinds of things on the web. So I think we are in a direction where we can see much more efficient collaboration in the future, both scientifically and in deploying useful things out there.
Mm-hmm. But one challenge might still remain. You mentioned that researchers mainly benefit from being recognized. So if you have a collaboration, how could you attribute the actual contributions, both from an academic recognition point of view, but also from a very commercial point of view, like who owns then the IPs of the results that have been found? How can you share the knowledge that has been collected?
This is a great question and a very hard one. And we do need to think harder about it. But here are some thoughts. So first of all, there's already a system that kind of works. It's not perfect in academia for credit assignment. The authors form a small group and they try to find a consensus of like author order and stuff like that. Also, we have a system of attributing credit through funding, right? So, and it's not perfect. There are lots of issues, lots of cases where people feel they have been, someone else is getting the credit where they should have. But overall, it's working reasonably well. And it works through a sort of consensus, for example, on grant committees. It works through how the community chooses to cite. So citations, for example, in the scientific community have become a very imperfect way of measuring how much credit is due to different contributions. And so it's not like we have the magic bullet, but we already know some things that work reasonably well. And a lot of these things are connected to recognition. But that means if we go for the kind of public domain organization that I'm talking about, a lot of the work is going to be about this credit assignment aspect of it. Like we need, it's like, journals, right? Most of the work is in reviewing and then discussing between the authors and the reviewers and between the reviewers, or in conferences, the same thing, to find out, what's the value or the relative value of different contributions. So we don't have, perfect solutions, but we do have expertise on how to do those things. And I think we can apply that expertise and probably improve it. And one part of my proposal that I didn't have time to talk about is that entities that would get the funding that I'm talking about would not just get like the usual grant funding in academia just pays for the costs, right? There's no notion of profit. But like here, if we want to extend this to non-academic entities like startups, which I think would be great, and also to incentivize academics to stay in academia and do research rather than go to industry, in addition to funding the costs, we could fund we could provide sort of rewards for the most successful contribution. So this credit assignment problem you're talking about, it's not just useful to decide who gets the grant for this or for that piece of the puzzle, but also that those organizations or those people that have contributed significantly to something that ends up being really useful for society also get some extra reward. So it's kind of we're playing the role of profit. And I think that would be an extra motivation that would help to keep some people, at least, that are, for example, the kind of people who start companies, to work on these public good projects rather than go to the for-profit type of projects.
Yeah, I agree. And this was also one of the questions in the chat, which fits in now nicely. You said that it's an incentive for the researchers if they see that their research work is also applicable and in a beneficial way. But we also see now with AI, and we have seen it in the past with other kind of technologies, that there's also misuse, unethical use as it was not intended by the researcher. Do you think that there is a risk if we don't stop this unethical and incorrect usage quickly, that the researchers will stop their research and will think, no, it's a bad technology, let's stay away from that?
Maybe. Yeah, it could go in this direction. Hopefully we can put in place better governance tools, better social norms, better regulations to you know, at least make sure that the positives outweigh the negatives. I think right now the positives do outweigh the negatives, but there are a lot of concerns, rightfully so. Yeah, so it's really important, the governance aspect of AI and technology in general. Any powerful tool needs to be properly managed from a social norms perspective. Otherwise, the pure self-interest incentive is almost automatically leads to abuse.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned in your talk that we need norms, international norms against misuse, specifically, for example, manipulation.
Yeah.
Do we already have the mechanisms of detecting it early enough? I mean, the norms are one thing, but the other thing is also you have to detect it, you have to notice.
I mean, it would be nice. I think it'd be nice to do, and there are already research projects in that direction. I don't think we're anywhere close to having those kinds of solutions, but I don't think we need them. I think human beings are quite able to know if, say, some ad or some social network kind of operation is really trying to manipulate you. So what we do need are rules and regulations that penalize those entities that are doing it, and then, you know, we'll find. I mean, there will be humans who like, think of it like judges, auditors, and things like that, who will play the role of implementing the principles that democratic societies will want to see respected in those instances.
But I would say we really have to act quickly, because otherwise we run the risk that we lose our ability to detect such cases. If they're becoming more and more popular, we might get used to it. We might think, well, this is now the normal way, like we get our news. There is always this bias. We can't escape anymore. So if we don't really act now, there might be the danger of.
I agree.
Late.
Yeah, this is a serious issue, and I think it's even worse than what you're saying, in the sense that those tools are being used to distort the democratic system, and if the powers that control those tools also control our democracies, well, I think we might be done. Think about like Big Brother scenario, right? It becomes very hard to undo the Big Brother scenario, because the organization that is manipulating your minds is also controlling society in general, and not making it easy for the democratic will to actually express itself and even know that there is a problem.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any suggestion about what we as researchers immediately can do?
Yes, we can participate in these kinds of conferences, but more importantly, I think we are trusted voices in our societies. We have the ear of governments, at least in some countries. We have the ear of the media. So I think we should play our role as citizens, but also citizens that can have a voice. And that means we also have a responsibility to be part of these debates, part of these collective discussions.
Mm-hmm. There was also the specific question, if we engage in conferences like this, a very practical question: how could one who is interested in join the AI for Commons?
I think if you go on the website, you can join.
Okay, there is an opportunity to do so. Let's also talk a little bit now about your perspective, more from a data science perspective. You mentioned that those projects also benefit from data from different sources.
Yes.
From a technical point of view, this is also quite challenging, because even if people are willing to share their data, it's not so easy, because they come in different flavor with different interpretations. How, from a technical point of view, can you really manage such a collective, collaborative cooperation, for example, in the field of drug discovery?
Yeah, this is a good question. I do think the major obstacles are social and political rather than technical, but you're right, there are technical issues when you mix different sources of data. In fact, it's one of the most interesting recent research directions in machine learning is, under different names, but you can call it out of distribution generalization, or transfer learning, or things like that. So the idea is, I may see some data from a particular distribution, or maybe I see some different distributions, like different sources of data, but then I'm going to deploy it or adapt it with very little data from a different distribution. How do I make sure that I'm going to learn in a way that I can deal with those different data sources? They're different because maybe they're collected in a different country using different machines, or people are not always reliable and exactly the same way. So that's one aspect. I think there's a lot of interesting research going on in machine learning, so we're going to make progress on that. Another aspect is, if we build the kinds of international organizations that I've been talking about, then we can create standards, right? It's going to be much easier if the way that we collect data, for example, assays, chemical assays, biological assays, in the case of drug discovery, but in the medical field in general, every country, or even in Canada, every province has their own standards. It's a huge mess, right? So I think really we have something to gain to agree on some sort of standards internationally. And medicine has created a lot of standards for naming things in a way that allows doctors from around the world to understand each other. So I think we can do it. It's an effort, but it's going to help a lot. Just the way that we collect data can be more rational, more standardized across the planet.
Mm. And as you mentioned, another challenge would also be legal aspects. If you combine data from different sources, they might come from different nations with different regulations with respect to security and privacy. So if you define, for example, a technical standard for the data integration, it might not be possible that all would adhere to that, because privacy, security rights might be.
So you need legal standards as well.
Mm-hmm.
And those legal standards, I mean, they're going to evolve, because right now we're at the beginning of a data era. And so we shouldn't think that it's all frozen. We have an opportunity to build those standards, whether they're the technical standards, the legal standards, and it's going to be mutually beneficial, right? So if you're a government in a country and you see a standard being developed around the world for, say, a particular kind of medical data, then there is an incentive to join this standard, because it's going to make it easier for you to benefit from the data from these other countries and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. There was another interesting comment that we might also try to use AI for monitoring and controlling our activities with that respect. So in order to make sure that our AI is used in an ethical way, we can could again use AI to detect possible frauds.
Yeah, I think there's some potential for that. I mean, there's already a lot of work on trying to do fraud detection, fake news detection. So, but we're still in the beginnings of that. And one reason why it's difficult is because we are very far from having machines which actually understand even how the world works around us and society works, even at the level of a child or something. So it's challenging. But I think we should continue doing that kind of research. And there is, in the long run, I think there's a huge potential for AI to help us create stronger democracies where the collective discussion that should drive collective decisions are going to be more rational, more inclusive, and less polluted by demagogy, which is essentially what is going on right now in the way that we do politics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's important that we not only look at the result at the end, but we really try to govern and define the whole process and define standards for the whole process of collaboration. Yeah. Well, our discussion is coming to an end, and maybe I would like to hand over now again to Amir to summarize and round up our session.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. Very interesting questions and definitely needed. As both you and Yoshua talk about democracy and basically providing mechanisms for collaboration and data sharing and data trust and support for good, I would like to ask each of you one question. And that question is a little bit higher level, but I think it would be interesting for the audience to have a synopsis of how you think about this. If, according to what your thesis was, Yoshua, we think about AI as a force for good or a public good, what would be one single things we have to do today to make sure we're on the roadmap to make AI becoming a public good? And what question for you as well, Gabrielle? Because from your vantage point, your research effort, ACM, and seeing all the things that you see, how can we basically put the first foundation to make sure that we are solidly grounded to get there?
Yeah, if I may start, I think also what we as ACM, as organization, could do is mostly on the line of creating awareness, and not only among researchers, as we have discussed before, but really awareness in the public. We need to tell the people, and I pretty much support Joshua's point of view, that AI is not magic, it's not a danger, it's simply a tool that we as humankind will be able to master. And so all those horror scenarios of killer robots are not realistic, because we are not going to build those kind of tools. And I truly hope that humankind will be smart enough, will be human intelligently enough not to allow those things to happen. But as we discussed before, this requires a lot of education among the people and a lot of awareness, and that's where we would like to contribute.
Yeah, I think Gabriela's answer is excellent. Nothing's going to happen of consequence if there are not enough people who understand those issues. And right now, the issues that we've been discussing today are not in the minds of most people. They're either considering AI as some like scary science fiction thing, or you know, oh, it's going to solve all our economic problems. So that's essential. I also think that we have a possibility of making small steps towards creating a different style of doing AI R&D and deployment that's more aligned with the common good, and that could be fueled by international collaboration and funding.
Yes, we come back to the topic of funding, and for funding to be effective, we usually need to understand what could be sustainable to get funded by local governments, institutions. So that sustainability maybe comes from this awareness and this collaboration that you talked about, Yoshua, and yourself, Gabriel, as well. If not everyone can become a machine learning expert or data scientist, how can we, all of us, be more aware and somehow start the process of understanding, but also participating efficiently?
So I think for sustainability of funding, you need to create sufficient examples of success that will make it clear for governments that it is in their financial interest to continue in a direction like this, right? I mean, we can do a little bit of mileage with philanthropy and, you know, people giving their time and so on, and it's great. The open source software kind of ecosystem works just from this, but in other cases, I think we need more. We need global coordination, global social norms, and global funding.
Yeah, I would like to comment on your statement that, of course, not all of us will become AI experts, and it's not necessary. But I think what would be very beneficial for creating awareness would be to highlight and to showcase successful AI projects. And I think this is also something that this platform could do, really promote and make visible the cases where AI is a good tool, is used in a good way. And as I said before, not only show the results at the end, but also show how well the whole process was set up. And this could then act as a role model, a template, a footprint for future projects, and maybe even go into guidelines for funding. If you want to get funding, you need to adhere to those best practices. This is some of my ideas in that direction.
Thank you again, Yoshua and Gabriel, for your time and participation, and always insightful and very positive outlook.